The island of Cuba is often seen as a fully sovereign nation, but in reality, a small part of it isn't controlled by the Cuban government at all. Down in the southeast lies Guantanamo Bay, home to a United States naval base that has existed since 1903. And as you probably know, relations between Cuba and the United States haven't always been friendly. In fact, during the rule of Fidel Castro, tensions between the two countries reached their absolute lowest point. Yet despite decades of hostility, and despite wanting full control of Cuban territory, Castro never attempted to seize Guantanamo Bay by force. So why not? Why didn't communist Cuba try to take back this strategically important piece of land and make the island whole again? To understand how Cuba ended up in this situation, we need to go back to the late 19th century. As the century drew to a close, Cuban revolutionaries rose up against Spanish colonial rule. Like most independence movements, they assumed that victory would mean full control over their territory. But their war soon attracted the attention of the United States, especially after the explosion of the USS Maine, which sparked widespread calls in America to push Spain out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, while many Americans supported removing Spain from Cuba, that didn't necessarily mean they supported full Cuban independence. To prevent outright annexation, the U.S. Congress passed the United States Congress-Teller Amendment, which technically forbade the United States from taking control of Cuba itself. But there was a loophole. During the Spanish-American War, American forces identified Guantanamo Bay as an ideal location for a naval base. Its position offered quick access to the Caribbean and allowed the U.S. Navy to monitor potential European interference in the region. After Spain's defeat, Cuba was occupied by the United States, with promises of eventual independence. However, that independence came with conditions. Washington imposed the Platt Amendment, which granted the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and demanded land for naval bases. Faced with little real choice, the Cuban government agreed in 1901. 2 years later, the United States formally established its base at Guantanamo Bay under a lease agreement that would last indefinitely. For decades, American influence in Cuba remained strong, especially under the rule of Fulgencio Batista, whose government maintained close ties with Washington. But as Batista's rule became increasingly authoritarian, resistance began to grow, eventually turning into armed rebellion. The most effective of these rebel groups was the July 26th movement, led by Fidel Castro. By 1959, Batista had fled the country and the Cuban Revolution had succeeded. Once in power, Castro rejected the legitimacy of the Guantanamo lease, arguing that it had been signed by a previous regime and should therefore be considered void. However, early in the new government's rule, Cuba accidentally cashed one of the annual lease payments sent by the United States, something Washington later used to argue that the agreement was still valid. Even so, Castro wanted the base returned. But he also understood the reality of the situation. While Cuban forces might have been capable of overrunning the relatively small American garrison station there, any attack on U.S. personnel would almost certainly have triggered a full-scale military response. And given the massive imbalance in power between Cuba and the United States, such a conflict could have threatened the survival of the revolutionary government itself. This fear wasn't unfounded. In 1961, the United States backed an attempted invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs invasion, approved by President John F. Kennedy. The invasion failed, but it pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union and set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. During this crisis, the base at Guantanamo became even more strategically important. Castro demanded its return as part of negotiations to remove Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba, but both Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev ultimately ignored Cuba's demands in order to reach a broader agreement between the superpowers. From that point on, Cuba had few realistic options. Military action was too risky. Diplomatic pressure achieved nothing. And there was simply no incentive strong enough to persuade the United States to give up such a valuable strategic asset. And so, despite decades of opposition from Havana, the United States remains at Guantanamo Bay to this day.